focus of right now. Wilder, Fury 2, here we go.
Daniel Jacobs had this to say. He says that Caleb Plant has a lot of flaws. He's the weakest of the 4 title holders at 168 pounds. The biggest change, Jacobs says, is he's no longer having struggles to make weight as he did when he was in his final fight at 160 pounds. It's time to be comfortable and be excited about bigger and better things, he said. I'm excited about the super middleweight division. As though he raced the 4 super middleweight title holders, Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, Caleb Plant, and David Benavidez. Jacobs didn't pick a top guy, but he does have a pick for the last on the list, even with due respect paid to him as well.
Still got Caleb at the bottom.
I would say all those guys are top fighters. I would probably put Plant at the bottom, Jacobs said. I think Plant is good, but I think he's beatable. I see a lot of flaws in his game. Benavidez is probably the strongest I've seen. Now these guys have my attention, and I'm going to be studying to look forward to what's next for me. There's this little weasel in my spine, and his name is Gabe Rosado, Jacobs said with a laugh. He's annoying the hell out of me. Lord have mercy. This guy, man. I'm going to tell you something.
What?
The super middleweight division is an underrated division because there's no shortage of talent. And there are good fights that can be made there, even with the politics of boxing, the politics that oftentimes stifle certain fights between certain fighters.
You sure?
Even with the politics, there are very good fights to be made at 168 pounds. You know, in my previous video, I talked about how the global pandemic, the delay that it's creating, it could end up costing Billy Joe Saunders the Canelo Alvarez fight. And if it does, if Billy doesn't get to fight Canelo because Canelo is fast-tracked into a Gennady Golovkin fight, one option for Billy is a Daniel Jacobs fight. Yeah, it's realistic. That if this delay costs Billy to fight, that he can always fight Danny, and that's a sizable fight, that's a good fight. I like that fight. And it's doable because both those guys, they're on the same side of the street. Now, by some chance, Billy don't like the sound of that for one reason or another. You know, maybe he decides he can fight Callum Smith. That's the perfect fight for the both of them guys. The both of them guys need a big fight, and they need a big fight right now. A fight between Billy and Callum, unification match for all the marbles. That makes a lot of sense too. And hypothetically speaking, if Billy were to end up fighting Callum as a result of the Canelo Alvarez fight falling through, where would that leave Danny? I'll tell you where that leaves Danny. You can have Daniel Jacobs fight John Ryder on the undercard as a prelude for the winner versus the winner. The winner of a Saunders versus Smith versus the winner of a Jacobs versus Ryder. It's the perfect scenario. It makes sense for everybody, okay? It's the ideal situation. The article, the name of Gabe Rosado was mentioned, it being that Gabe Rosado was on standby for Daniel Jacobs' recent fight with Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., that if something happens to Chavez, you know, Gabe Rosado would stand in. In truth, I've no interest in seeing Daniel Jacobs fight Gabe Rosado at 168 pounds at this point. I just don't see what that would accomplish. That if Daniel Jacobs is going to be fighting somebody that doesn't hold a world title, you know, somebody who's not a champion, it really shouldn't be Gabe Rosado. It should still be somebody
the top 10.
Solid, somebody formidable at this weight. And I happen to think that John Ryder makes a lot more sense than a Gabe Rosado. If we look at Gabe Rosado, God bless him, we all know him. He's been there, he's done that, you know. I'd rather see Gabe Rosado fight the likes of a Jaime Munguia at 160 pounds. I think that is a fight that makes a lot of sense. You know, Jaime Munguia, he's a newbie to the middleweight division. He needs those experienced fights because, let's be honest, they're not going to match that kid against the champion just yet.
They're not.
A very experienced guy who's been in there with a lot of people, anywhere from 154 to 160 to 168, is Gabe Rosado. You put Gabe Rosado in there with Jaime Munguia, and ladies and gentlemen, you got yourself a fight because Jaime's not so put together that he simply walks through Gabe.
Not yet.
It's an ideal situation that has the potential to be competitive because Jaime Munguia is still ironing out the wrinkles. He is not yet so put together a boxer that he can simply steamroll someone as experienced as a Gabe Rosado, who's got his shit to him. You know, he's crafty when he wants to be. I think that is a fight that makes more sense for Gabe than a Daniel Jacobs fight. When it comes to Jacobs, I'd rather see Jacobs with a John Ryder. Hell, even a Martin Murray makes a little bit more sense to me, you know, for Danny at 168 than a Gabe Rosado fight. I don't see what that would accomplish. And the catalyst that could potentially set all these events in motion is Canelo Alvarez. Whether or not Canelo Alvarez goes through with the Saunders fight, his very next fight, or whether or not he's fast-tracked into a Golovkin fight as a result of the delay the pandemic has caused. If Canelo don't fight Billy's going to need somebody to fight. Smith or Jacobs makes a lot of sense for him, depending on who he chooses. Jacobs could end up fighting, you know, John Ryder, somebody like that. Makes a lot of sense. And if Gabe is in the mix, if Gabe's name is in the hat for anything, I just happen to think that Rosado versus Munguia, that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to see it happen in that order, though it is a lot of wishful thinking. We'll see how it all breaks down once boxing resumes. As far as Daniel Jacobs' anecdotes, his assessment of the proverbial totem pole at 168 pounds, the pecking order. You know, he didn't really name a top guy. We know who the ranked standings have at number one, more or less. It's Callum Smith. Though how tight of a grip he has on that number one spot, that's
very contentious.
It's tenuous, to say the least. That even if Callum Smith is number one, he ain't number one by much. He's not head and shoulders over all these other guys, above all these other guys. He's really not. He sports a victory over George Groves. Solid victory. I'd say comparatively, Callum Smith's victory over George Groves is a better victory than, say, Caleb Plant's victory over Jose Uzcategui. I think it's fair to say that. I think it's fair to say that, you know, Callum Smith's victory over George Groves is better than David Benavidez's 2 victories over Ronald Gavril, a guy who's really faded into the background the last couple of years.
He disappeared.
Ronald Gavril's a solid guy, but I don't think beating Ronald Gavril is on par with beating George Groves. However, you know, David Benavidez,
last year,
he's got that victory over Anthony Durrell. And I think that, you know, all things considered, that victory is on par with Callum Smith's victory over George Groves. Might even be a little better because Anthony Durrell had only ever lost one fight. You know, he was a WBC champion at the time. He had a pro record of 33 wins, 1 loss. Never been stopped. Had not been stopped until David stopped him. And, you know, Anthony Durrell, he had a pretty good resume. You know, he actually stopped Caleb Truax. Stopped that guy, you know. He beat Truax, he beat Marco Antonio Rubio, Avni Yildirim. He had 2 fights with Sakio Bika. Had a fight with Badu Jack. Lost that fight, lost the decision. But you look at Anthony Durrell's body of work ahead of what was the David Benavidez fight, and this was a guy who'd definitely been around the block.
Very experienced guy.
Guy's been there and done that. Only lost 1 fight, and I dare say that
if you compare them,
David Benavidez's victory over Anthony Durrell is on par with Callum Smith's victory over George Groves. I think I can say that. I think I can say that, and there's some merit to it. When it comes to Daniel's assessment of Caleb Plant, him being at the bottom of the totem pole, I don't agree with that. I don't. I have to say that of the 4 world champions in the super middleweight division, the one who has proven the least is not Caleb Plant. It's Billy Joe Saunders. I mean, think about it. Billy Joe Saunders hasn't even been there that long, and what he has done there ain't nothing to write home about. You won the vacant WBO title fighting Shafat Isufi. Where the hell did they find that guy? And then you defended it against who? Coceres? Who the hell is he? Whereas, at least with Caleb, we can say that he fought a solid, albeit limited fighter in Vincent Fagan Boots. Yeah, we can say that. We can say that, you know, Caleb winning the IBF title from Jose Uzcategui is a lot better than Saunders winning the vacant WBO title against Shafat Isufi. I think we can say that. I think that comparatively, Caleb Plant has a better super middleweight resume than Billy does. Emphasis on super middleweight. We are talking about what these guys have done at 168 pounds. Not what they've done somewhere else, but, at 168 pounds. I feel that Caleb has proven more, He fought a seasoned vet in Porky Medina. Obviously, Porky had seen better days, but I think beating Porky means a little more than beating Kosaris or Isufi, and
Yeah, kinda.
you think about what else Caleb Plant has done. He beat Mike Lee, and Mike Lee was a very limited fighter that I didn't think Mike Lee stood a shot in the dark of winning that fight, but Mike Lee was undefeated at the time, and I think that looks a little better than what Saunders has done so far.
At 168.
Caleb's victory over Jose Uzcategui is a more solid victory than any victory Billy Joe Saunders has amassed in the super middleweight division. So you ask me who I think is at the bottom of the totem pole, and I think it's Billy Joe Saunders. That's not saying that he can't go on to do bigger and better things, but we're talking about right now based on what these guys have done so far. I think it's Billy that's at the bottom of the totem pole. I think it's Billy that perhaps could be the weakest of the 4 world champions in the division until he proves otherwise. It's up to him and what he's doing to write the story and to tell it. And this is a situation to where, some guys have got 1 or 2 better wins than some other guys, but nobody's quite head and shoulders above anyone else. It's for this reason that these guys need to be fighting, and they need to be fighting each other. Caleb Plant needs to have that Benavidez fight, and Billy Joe Saunders, he needs to have that Callum Smith fight. That's what needs to happen. And that's just my assessment of the landscape. Feel free to disagree. In middleweight news, Andrade to Charlo. I'm the best, and I'm willing to put that into action. $7 million? Come on, man, that's a lot of money. Andrade told Hearn, referencing the sum that was offered to Charlo so that a fight could take place. Supposedly, he says that he's the best. I say I'm the best, and I'm willing to put that in action. It has to be the other way around, too. All I can do is keep winning and keep taking the challenges. Charlo was offered a 1-fight deal by Hearn December to fight Andrade on DAZN and unify the division's titles, but ultimately decided to turn it down. You have to look at it as a business, said Andrade. Win, lose, or draw. Fighting me is going to kill their cha-cha-ching. Some people lose, and their contract goes down a number. Why are they going to take a risk of fighting Andrade if there's a possible chance of them losing and having to start all over again? If you're good, if you're Canelo Alvarez, Gennady Golovkin, Billy Joe Saunders, or the Charlo brothers, and if you lose to the better man in me, and you continue to show your own legacy, you can still be a Hall of Fame guy. You just lost to the greatest guy. That's how I look at it. I want to put my skill, talent, and willingness against anybody. You really can't offer Jamal Charlo enough money to take that fight. You can't do it.
Nope.
There is a precedence set by what the fighter is already making versus what the fighter is being offered. That they ain't giving Jamal Charlo $5, $6, $7 million to fight the guys that he's been fighting. No, of course not. You think they gave this guy something like $5, $6 million to fight Brandon Adams or Dennis Hogan?
Nope.
Of course not. So there's a precedent set by what the fighter is already making, fight by fight, versus what's being offered to him. And $7 million, that should have been more than enough for Jamal to go in there against Demetrius Andrade and hash it out. But he didn't want to do it. Right now, he's being tabbed to fight Chris Eubank Jr. It's a good fight. It's a solid fight. I view that fight the same way that I view the Errol Spence versus Danny Garcia fight, in the sense that, yeah, it's a good fight. It's a solid fight. Could be entertaining, but it's really not the biggest and best fight for you now, is there?
Is it?
And you're certainly not running the same risks with Danny that you'd be running with Terrence. The same applies in this situation. Yeah, Jamal Charlo versus Chris Eubank Jr. is a good fight, but you're not running the same risks with Chris that you'd be running with Demetrius. In the Demetrius Andrade fight, you'd actually stand to make more money in that fight, but, Jamal, you just can't get him to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a fine line between negotiating for the best money you can get and selling your belt to the highest bidder. I mean, look, it's pugilism. It's prize fighting. So I fully understand the importance of the overall prize. I get that, trying to negotiate for the best money that you can get. But this is pretty good money, all things considered. I mean, you think Jamal Charlo's gonna make $7 million fighting Chris Eubank Jr.?
Huh?
Where?
Not around here.
I mean, what's the plan here? What's the bottom line? What, you're gonna stage Charlo versus Eubank as a pay-per-view in the States in the hopes that you'll yield that kind of a return? Is that what the plan is? Because let me tell you something. Here in the States, they don't know Chris, and they barely know Jamal.
I'm lying?
Oh, yeah, he's got boxing fans that'll watch him on free TV. He's got those kinds of boxing fans, but he ain't got the kind of boxing fans that want to pay $79 to see him fight. He ain't got those kinds of fans. Whereas right now, you know, the people over there at the Zone, they're not asking you to make a commitment. They're not asking you to enter some multi-year, multi-fight situation. Nah, if you believe in yourself, we'll offer you a one-off, $7 million. You go over there, you fight that guy, and for Jamal, that wasn't enough money. This accents what I've been telling you all along, that there's a fine line between negotiating for the best money that you can get and selling your belt to the highest bidder. That the way that Jamal is handling the situation, what it accents is an overall lack of competitive spirit and ambition, because $7 million should have been enough to get your juices going. And, you know, for Jamal, that wasn't enough. And I don't think it's because he's making that kind of money. You're not going to convince me that paying this guy $7 million fight by fight to fight the guys that he's been fighting. Brandon Adams, Dennis Hogan, Matt Korobov. No way. Okay? The look of it is that the only way they could get Jamal in the ring is, I don't know, offering him 10, maybe even $15 million to fight the likes of a Demetrius Andrade. But what that accents is a lack of ambition. Furthermore, what that accents is fear, apprehensiveness, that you don't want to walk into a situation like that where you might lose unless you are heavily compensated for walking into that situation. More compensation than you actually deserve, because I hate to tell you this, but Jamal Charlo ain't no $10 million fighter. He's really not even a $7 million fighter, if we're going to be honest.
No, not right now.
Jamal Charlo, he's not bringing in those kind of prices, fight by fight. And you're not going to convince me otherwise, all right? You don't pay a guy $7 million to fight the likes of a Dennis Hogan. You just don't do it. You'd be frittering money away. You'd be pouring money down the drain for what are showcase fights.
Pretty much.
And that's not the way the business works, okay? You don't pay that kind of money to a guy for that kind of an opponent. Just don't work like that. And the look of it is that, you know, I think Jamal would sooner travel to the super middleweight division than do anything with Demetrius Andrade in the middleweight division. And you know what? Jamal Charlo already said as much, so it's not even my assumption. This is out of the horse's own mouth. There's not a lot of new ground to cover here. When a fighter behaves the way that Jamal Charlo is behaving in reference to this Andrade fight, what that accents is a lack of ambition, a lack of competitive drive, and it accents the distinction between negotiating for a good price and selling your belt, selling your O. That seems more in keeping with what Jamal Charlo's doing.